Good morning. Father Michael here. Well, today is the fourth day that we are going to talk about the women in Matthew's genealogy of Jesus, the ancestors and the forebears of Christ. And our list so far has been curiously entwined with human sexuality, particularly sexuality that is expressed outside the box of social convention, we could say. So if you remember, we started with Tamar in the book of Genesis, who pretended to be a hooker so that she could conceive a child with her stepfather and secure her life within the family. And then we talked about Rahab, who wasn't pretending to be anything. She was just a professional, full-time hooker, sex worker with a heart of gold, who nonetheless was given a chance to be part of God's larger plan, and she did that without making a career change. Yesterday, I talked a little bit about Ruth. Ruth, who used her physical beauty and her feminine sexuality to attract Boaz to her, going so far as to crawling into his bed one night when he was blackout drunk, passed out in his sleep from drinking too much, and she uncovered his feet, which was a pious rabbi attempt to allude to her having taken off his boxers, and snuggled up with him. And so today we are going to talk a little bit about Bathsheba, the wife of King David, but she was someone else's wife first. She was that nudist who lived next to the palace, apparently, who was out sunning herself one day on the top deck. And she was so attractive that David allowed himself to be seduced by her, not only into adultery, but also he murdered her husband, Uriah. So, what is up with this? Our scriptures, Christian scriptures, consistently, all four of the canonical versions, all of them consistently refer to Jesus as Son of David. But and we don't even think twice about that, but it's such a sexist construct. Because he's also, if he is the son of David, then he is also the son of Bathsheba. If you look again at Matthew's telling of the genealogy, the begats, as we call that, when that reading comes up on a Sunday, I could just jump out the stained glass window. And we're only one floor, so I wouldn't even hurt myself. But oh my goodness, what a tedious reading that is. But looking again at all of those begats, there is a concerted, traditional Jewish way that Matthew is putting that genealogy together, father to son, as if women somehow were an optional part of the process of making babies. It's all tidy and neat and clean, and it becomes redundantly boring and really not very inspiring. Father to son, etc., etc., etc. But Matthew does something different, and he throws in a few women, even though he doesn't have to, I think, to stir things up a little bit, because when we add in the names of some women, things are not so neat and clean and orderly and tidy. It gets a little bit messy. it gets a little buried in the shades of gray, so to speak. So why is this? It's not because women have a different kind of humanity than we men do, that women are somehow live in a murkier, more grayish reality than us. It's because of the way men have treated women. And damn it, continue to treat women, even in the Christian community. So if you look back, once the goddess religions fade away, once men come to realize that the mystery of human procreation requires a donation from their side, that respect for women and those matriarchal religions are suppressed and done away with. And so then we have a long-ass history of the mistreatment of women by men. Enslavement, polygamy, disenfranchisement, abduction, rape, murder. The list goes on. So if, in the giving of the genealogy, if we fall back on our typical male protocol, if we just focus on us, we don't have to talk about the shadow side of life. We don't have to even address the uglier aspects of how we males have created and maintained our superiority and entitlement. The truth is that the dream of God, the kingdom, if you will, does not hide from the shadow side, does not hide from ugliness and violence and injustice. In fact, the dream of God is constructed from and often in response to the shadow side of humanity's ugliness. That's ironic. We're still living in a certain bubble, I think. A bubble of not wanting to face our own truth. We don't want to face what's happening in the present, and we sure as hell don't want to address what happened in the past. We do not want to tell the ugly stories of our country's past, for example. We don't want our children to know who we have been and why we are still sometimes well within that shadow world, that tradition. We pretend that, that there was ever a country called the United States where we didn't practice genocide and lynching and slavery and discrimination of all kinds. Everybody has gotten used to the idea of having a Martin Luther King holiday. But I think for the most part, we ignore the context in which he lived and breathed and wrote his best speeches and did his best ministering. We ignore his hopes and dreams that he had within the ugliness of the 1950s and 60s so that his 4 kids would live in a better, more compassionate, more Christ-like world. In other words, Martin Luther King doesn't make sense except in the context of ugliness. A while back, I had a series of lengthy exchanges with a former student of mine. He's an evangelical fundamentalist with, more superficial, fill-in-the-blank type answers than anybody that I know. And so it was weird having that conversation, and he noticed that I try to avoid referring to God with male pronouns. And he asked why liberals play that game with God's gender. And I told him, well, number one, God is pure spirit. Spirits don't have genitals. And the fact that we call God He goes back to our collective patriarchal past. And in fact, if we focus only on that one aspect of the divine name, that we do a disservice to who God really is. Because how we name God not only affects our understanding, but it affects us. It's a revelation of who we are more than it is about who God is. And when we refer to God, I'm trying to explain this to him in simple language, when we refer to God maybe in unconventional ways, Father, Mother is one that I use quite often, it kind of frees us to think outside the box of our limited past. And it helps us pause for a moment and consider how we are treating women in the present, naming the women in our biblical stories, especially the ones who have been ignored and sidelined. And it doesn't do any damage to the scriptures, but it does change the way that we hear the stories. And like I said, it tells us more about ourselves than anything else. Well, of course, he was offended, and like many people, who live in a black and white universe, there just was no meeting ground. There was no give and take at all. And even though he's 30, he still has his 8-year-old faith. So be it. So be it. But getting back to Bathsheba, when Matthew refers to her, he doesn't use her name. Like I said, names matter. He calls her the wife of Uriah. That's how it goes. So I think it's important that when we are in this Advent cycle, approaching the Christmas holiday, holy day, we need to focus on the reality of who Jesus is. He is a descendant of both David and Bathsheba. And if we can admit that and embrace that, even with the questionable behaviors of both David and Bathsheba, more responsibility on him, he's the king after all, we can have a little more tolerance for our life in the Shadowlands in which we live. If we hold fast to the belief that God is faithful to the descendants of Bathsheba, then I think we have a little more space for ourselves to consider what it means for us as imperfect descendants of imperfect people. We also have, as a result, I think, a truer sense of what it means for us who choose to follow Jesus, who choose to walk in the footsteps of a Savior who did not bring easy answers. Not once. He just told people salvation is now. Salvation has come to your house today. Not in some heaven light years away. Today. No easy answers. Do the right thing. Turn away from your sin. Be better. That's not very specific. Because life is complicated. Always complicated. As I look at the Jesus of the Gospels, I think I can see pretty clearly at this point in my life that Jesus is a lot more like his ancestor Bathsheba than he ever was like his ancestor King David. After all, Jesus was the one who chose to spend a lot of time with women on the road. Historically, he needed those wealthy widows to support the ministry. They're welcome with him, where they are not welcome within that strand of. So he chose to spend time with women who, even the ones who had scandal attached to their names, like his own mother, like his great, 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 great Bathsheba. He hung out and he ate and he drank and he partied with sex workers and tax collectors and thieves and hustlers and gays and transgenders and losers and anybody you want to throw in that pile. And don't forget addicts and alcoholics. And he was found at the tables and in the homes of these people, where the good, the so-called good people, would not ever have dared show their faces. Unfortunately, Bathsheba, as an ancestor of Jesus Christ, is not remembered accurately. She's not remembered for the total person that she was. She's remembered for the worst thing that ever happened to her, and how something good came out of the evil that was done to her. The same thing is true of all these young people who are overdosing on fentanyl. They are not remembered for the totality of who they were. They're remembered for the worst thing that happened to them. And it's up to us, those who loved them and cared for them and wanted them to survive and thrive. It's up to us to make something good out of the bad that happened to them. God does not will anything bad to happen to anybody, and he certainly did not will anything bad to happen to Bathsheba. But what God did was to take those torn and broken threads, born of tears and shame and humiliation and sadness, and weave that into something more amazing than Bathsheba could ever have imagined. And it's a beauty that is all the more stunning because you and I know the messiness and the shadows and the ugliness that lay at the heart of that transformation. This is true for you, and it's true for me. God sees the violence. God sees the causes of our PTSD and of our addictive behaviors and our sadness and all of that, our shame, our feelings of not being good enough. And God just wants us to take a damn breath and surrender those torn and broken threads so that something beautiful might be made from it. Pray with me. Loving God, weaver of our broken threads, light in our shadows, we come into your presence in this moment, mindful of our own brokenness and imperfections. Help us today to surrender these things a little better than we did yesterday. Help us to be mindful of all those forebears in the faith who were imperfect, who were able to take their brokenness and with your divine help, make something amazing. For all of our hurt, we know your grace